Ready?
There we go. Okay, so I guess. All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for coming to the Embodied Intelligence seminar. We're going to be holding the seminar every week on Thursday at 4 p.m. So today is a special occasion where this is happening on Monday. We'll have a short question and answer session after this talk. For people who are watching this on YouTube or like a Zoom, we'll be monitoring the questions and we'll be like asking him on your behalf. So there's also an EI social after this in the Stata Center. So like after a Q&A session, we can all walk there and you can hang out with our speaker, Oriol, today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Oriol Vinyals. Oriol is a principal research scientist at DeepMind and a team lead of the deep learning group. His work focuses on deep learning and artificial intelligence. And prior to joining DeepMind, Oriol was part of the Google Brain team. He holds a PhD from the ECS department from the University of California, Berkeley. And he has also been the recipient of various awards, including the 2016 MIT Technology Review 3535 Innovator Award. I'm really excited to have Oriol here with us today in person, finally. Last time the talk was actually over Zoom like 2 years ago. I'm sure you're already familiar with his work, including seek-to-seek, model distillation, and WaveNet, AlphaStar, AlphaFold, and AlphaCode. And some of these you'll be talking about today. So welcome to the seminar.
Great.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. It's great. Yeah, thanks. So we have a very multimodal setup. I hope things are okay online as well. So yeah, it's great to be in the real world in 3 dimensions, embodied. Maybe I'll be the only thing embodied on this talk because even though I consider these forms of intelligence, neither AlphaFold or AlphaCode have bodies. So maybe it's not the best topic for this seminar, but it's great to actually be in person. And indeed, in 2020, I gave sort of maybe part 1 of this talk, which focus a bit more on the deep learning toolbox. And today I will focus maybe on a kind of how you apply these ideas in these kind of grand challenges or settings that we often do in the field. And we've definitely been doing that in the past few years over at DeepMind as well. Also, if you do have any questions that cannot wait, I'm happy to take them also during the talk, but at the end, happy to chat as well. Great. So this is actually a slide from the talk that I gave online from London. So it took me a bit of more energy to come here to the sunny and warm Boston. I'm impressed. I'm impressed that there's a place that is colder than London at this time of the year. But anyhow, this is kind of the beginning or the end of that talk and the beginning of this one. It's recognizing that machine learning, deep learning, you can sort of attack a research problem and generate some ideas, but usually these ideas transcend the application area sometimes, or even the domain in science and so on. And that's the whole point of machine learning and deep learning, is to reuse these tools somewhere else, somewhere surprising. Maybe you even are not going to be the one doing that. Somewhere else in the community will do that. And it's great to be seeing these over and over in the community. That's, I think, part of the success is the reusability of these building blocks. So I'll give a very brief refresher on a topic that I'm just so passionate about. I have to talk about, which is sequence learning. But maybe starting from a super basic perspective on maybe machine learning in general, there's maybe the most common form is obviously supervised learning. And here the algorithmic pieces on the left sort of mimic maybe breakthroughs that enabled, almost dramatically made us be here today, because without which any of the right-hand side, which is hardware, software, actually in the order that is here is data, software, and hardware. Without this, we probably would not have had the many successes that we've had in machine learning and deep learning in particular. And the setting of supervised learning is also fairly straightforward. There's some data, maybe paired input-output vectors, X, Y. Then there's a model or a mapping that's parameterized usually by a deep neural network, which already can include many of these toolbox pieces that I mentioned. You define a loss in supervised learning to how good your approximation f of x of y is. And last but not least, you run your optimization machine or over maybe distributed data centers and so on to find the theta that optimizes this loss, right? And this is a very, very simple recipe. And the problem that I was maybe very passionate about already during my PhD days is that of like data is not always a vector. Data is very messy, and you can vectorize it as a sequence, but these sequences are of variable length and of different complexity. So here there are a few modalities that, especially back in 2012 or so, they were not obvious how to apply deep learning methods, especially and neural nets too. And thanks to many of the advances in the toolbox, now we kind of have even maybe a single model that does it all. So on to sequence modeling. Sequence modeling is you could see it as a form of supervised learning, because the output generally is if you're generating the output is predicting the next output t+1 from a sequence up to from 1 to t. And then again, it's not that different from supervised learning. You can maximize the log probability of a sequence through the chain rule, and that's fairly straightforward and what most of the applications in language modeling, for instance, and what AlphaCode, for instance, did. But there's other losses and so on, right? You can see that the toolbox is not only about the model or what is the neural network look like. It's also about the loss, the optimizers, and actually the data augmentations and all these things. So let's walk you through maybe intuitively what happened in the field of kind of trying to model any sequence of any length. And intuitively, I will use language modeling, which is very natural. And here, what we see is that the key insight is that we might receive a variable length sequence of tokens or bytes or words. And we want to create a function f that will be able to map these onto a single vector, right? That's kind of the challenge if you're starting with deep learning and sequence modeling 101. And ideally, there are some properties that are desirable of this function. In language, for instance, order matters. You would like the order of the words to mean something. It's not a bag of words approach. Is the order in this case would matter for language. Sometimes it might not, though. It's variable length. It should be differentiable, ideally. So we want to apply gradient descent, which is an efficient way to maybe bootstrap evolution more efficiently than in terms of cost and hardware and so on, and energy. And then you would like in language, again, maybe specifically that individual or pairwise interactions of words have a dramatic effect or nonlinear effect on this function, right? If I add a word not in the middle of a sentence, it changes its meaning dramatically. So that is a desirable property that deep learning and nonlinear models usually afford. And last but not least, all that you read in terms of bytes, be it a video, a book, or the whole Wikipedia, you would want that to be present in the deciding what the next word would be, which is the classic language modeling task. And there's a plethora of methods spanning from actually Shannon, who already was dreaming about generating English from Ngram models many decades ago. And then more modernly, we have deep learning methods, recurrent neural networks, LSTMs, convolutions, and last but not least, transformers, which currently at present are state of the art for a variety of reasons. And I'll tell you what transformers are, because the two projects, AlphaFold and AlphaCode, heavily relied on this particular architecture. So transformers rely on one piece of the toolbox, which is the attention principle, which was introduced modernly by Badenau et al. In 2014. And the idea is a fairly simple one if you know a bit about vector algebra and neural networks. So here, the main intuition is that we will get maybe a set of inputs like the sequence that we're reading in this case, we would have 7 symbols that we've loaded. We mapped with a linear layer to a fixed dimensional vector, and we have 7 of those. We can call those keys. And then to decode, we have some sort of recurrent neural network or apparatus that creates a query Q2. And the key insight is that this query Q2, from which we would want to predict the next word, instead of just being a recurrent neural network, which would be a state machine that holds all of its memory into a single vector where you can keep adding maybe with gates like LSTMs and so on, instead of doing that, you break that bottleneck by essentially creating a dot product, right? Q and Ks are vectors, so you just create these vectors, you compute the dot product between the query and then all the memory that you have in the encoder side, in this case for machine translation, as I showed this in this example. And then you normalize these with a softmax nonlinearity. All of these are differentiable, pretty straightforward operations. And then that gives you sort of a weighted sum over these keys that you can then sort of read from this input encoder. And that actually created what most systems are using or were using in 2015, 16 to do translation, for example, at Google, Baidu, and Facebook, as far as I know. So that same principle is what created transformers. Transformers are not very different from this principle, but there's a few details that, of course, matter a lot. And in deep learning, we find that details matter quite a bit. Maybe luckily, maybe sadly, you decide if you're a practitioner. So again, in what we call attention, cross-attention, self-attention, you would have, again, a set of inputs from which you create not only the keys, there would be 2 inputs with 2 keys, but also values. And then the queries, in this case, there's 3 queries. Again, you do the dot products between all the queries and all the keys, and then you would get 6 scalars in this particular example. And what you do a bit differently, and again, there's a lot of details how you initialize the weight matrices involved on these linear projections, etc., is that then you would take a weighted sum of the values, right, which is a different mapping that you're learning. All of these, of course, is differentiable, so you can learn through backprop. And then these readouts are from the values, and then off you go. You maybe have a sort of MLP, a linear layer, and you have some outputs. And if the inputs in the key values and the inputs for these queries are actually the same sequence of vectors, then this is actually called self-attention and is the key ingredient of the very now well-known and highly cited paper from Vaswani et al. In 2017, which it's called Attention is All You Need. And that is kind of the principle that used, and if you think of the properties of F, it has all the right properties, and it's a very powerful neural network that beyond doing machine translation, which was what it was originally proposed for, can do many different things. Great, so this is a bit of an introduction to sequence modeling, refreshing a bit or brushing a bit of this toolbox. And then after this, I would like to obviously walk you through maybe the process of how do you mix and match these components. And also, there's actually teams behind these breakthroughs that you might have seen or might have read papers on magazines or whatnot. And one cool thing that I try to do here is visualize a very simplified timeline of research that has been happening at DeepMind. I started in 2016 because I think AlphaCode was kind of maybe the kind of a very major breakthrough in terms of a large project that the company was behind. And then I put here a bit of kind of almost a dependency tree of projects that then span other projects. And why did they span them? Because some ideas or even the people behind the teams doing one mixed and matched as well to create the next project. And you will see these 3 representation during the talk, where I'll try to explain which ideas or which sort of affordances came from which when I discuss or explain a bit about AlphaFold and AlphaCode. So hopefully this makes sense. And obviously this is in the grand scheme of things what DeepMind is trying to do ultimately. So maybe this future work should be pointing more and more towards solving intelligence to advance science and benefit humanity. So there is certainly a high degree of science in AlphaFold, of course. It's a scientific breakthrough. And in terms of solving intelligence, I chose AlphaCode because it represents kind of a very difficult accomplishment, I think, from this, from what we thought it was possible or not, as I'll describe later on achieving the level of the degree of performance in these coding competitions that programmers kind of participate online. Great, so let's dive in. And one of the fun parts of being in machine learning or deep learning is that you get to learn other scientific domains that you might, have dreamt about doing or having some influence towards. And because of the explosion of how machine learning is transcending to other fields, you get to do that. But of course, it's quite interesting to understand the problem, the scientific problem, that you're also sort of seeing a data set of input outputs, but at the end of the day, it's useful to know what's up, right? Why is this problem important? And again, I'm presenting these two works. There are large teams behind it. The AlphaFold Breakthrough happened, as you probably can recognize, during a pandemic. And so this is actually a picture that the team took right after submitting their system to the CASP competition that I'll explain in a bit. So proteins is a common word. I heard it a lot, but I actually had no clue what proteins were, as I said. So I kept seeing these spirally looking things. And as I said, it's quite fun, even though in theory, you don't need to be an expert of protein foldings or biology. It's quite useful to get some intuitions, because then you can actually pick the pieces of the toolbox that will have the right inductive biases and so on. And this was actually critical for the success of AlphaFold. So, I mean, proteins are everywhere. They do a lot of different things. Maybe these days we have seen proteins through these spiky things from the COVID virus, sadly, but they are like kind of everywhere. And they have a few critical properties that made them a very good machine learning problem, as I'll explain. There's a huge impact, of course, proteins can have. In fact, as you might have heard, after AlphaFold, we decided to invest in a company that will try to accelerate drug discovery. Quite important and quite relevant these days. But there's lots of different things that, if you knew the shape of proteins, you can do a bit better to gain intuitions about how things interact with one another, including drugs with viruses, for example. And why is this a problem that machine learning could help? Is because it turns out that there is a cheap part of proteins, which is sequencing the protein itself. So that's relatively, thankfully, straightforward these days to get a protein sequence into kind of the code that encodes its shape. But it's sadly very costly. And here I show a pipeline. Again, I'm not an expert, so please no questions about this slide. But there's a pipeline of what you have to do to go from, okay, this is the protein, like these letters that you often see, to, oh, this is how it looks in 3 dimensions. And it is quite important. And actually, because of the pandemic, the sequencing of the proteins relevant in the virus were done kind of almost immediately. This is something that you do in, I don't know, like I'm not going to say, but it's order of days, let's say at most. And the sequencing of it, like, the actual shape that the protein took, that took months, even though, of course, this was a high priority for all of humanity to get it folded and to understand its 3D shape. And it was so much so that we actually, in fact, released our own predictions to the community for people that were investigating the disease, and they could do so rapidly. And then once someone in the lab sort of crystallized and did all these processes, they could verify that indeed the predictions we had were actually quite accurate. But of course, that we don't know, because one is cheap, the other is expensive, right? So zooming a bit into this, right? What's relatively straightforward is sequencing the protein, which means finding the sequence of these little words, right? They're like literally letters. They are less than the alphabet in English. And these signify some sort of conformation of atoms, right? And then once this chain, if you were to put this chain as a chain, physics and all sorts of energies and so on make this fold into particular shapes that happen to attract or attach to your lungs or other things, right? So sorry, that's my naive explanation. Hopefully it does make sense, but there is basically a mapping between the 3D shape on the right, which is the output, and the input, which is the sequence of letters. And just to summarize what has happened in the community is that there is an awesome data set of proteins put together, of proteins that have been crystallized. And there's been a competition where basically every 2 years is held, and there are some held out proteins that some labs are crystallizing that conform a test set of proteins that were not previously crystallized. And then there is an automated methods that range from, or in trying to simulate the physics, to other methods, now obviously including machine learning as well, that predict in 3D what's the shape of these proteins. And then what happened in 2018, we actually participated, and the delta was fairly significant compared to previous years in this GDT. You can think of something about 90 or above is basically solving the problem according to the experts, because then you start entering sort of issues with the crystallization process. So in 2018, we had a system that was quite different actually than the one I'll present a bit more in depth now, but that it actually started to look like we could tackle this problem, right? And then the team kept working on it. And after 2 years, we participated in 2020. I think the deadline was something like May or June or so. We submitted to the system, and then when the results came back, because that's a real test set, I mean, we could be overfitting and there could be all sorts of issues. We saw that the results were really, really good. And then kind of the world was, oh, wow, how did this jump happen? As you can see, for many years, there's a bit of progress, but it's not clear. And then all of a sudden, there was this jump. And to give you an idea on what this 90 number over 100, like 100 would be perfect, means this is kind of predictions, experimental versus computational, which is what AlphaFold does automatically in a few milliseconds, or it's rather quick to fold rather than this laboratory process that is quite expensive. And you can see sort of, it looks very aligned. Of course, things matter, and I'm not a biologist, so I don't know what these things actually do, but this is actually quite relevant in terms of being useful for downstream tasks, as I was saying. So there is obviously a paper that has a lot more detail, and I invite you to take a look. And then also there's actually, this was open source, which is amazing to see the reception and people trying their proteins. And it's been quite incredible to see the reaction from people. But let's actually take a look at how it works, because it's actually quite simple. So first and foremost, this is also like a sort of sequence to sequence problem, in the sense that you have a sequence of these letters that are, again, cheap to obtain for any given new protein. And then when you receive this sequence of letters, you do two things, or three things rather. One is you pass them as an input to a neural network that is the AlphaFold system that will try to predict its 3D structure. But additionally, it has two side information that is quite useful and critical. One is, given the protein or this sequence, there are related proteins that this evolves from, and we all know what mutations and evolutions of these things are nowadays more than maybe we did 2 years ago. And then what you're doing is, there's a massive database of these sequence of letters, and you look for evolutionarily related sequences. And this matters. This gives you a good hint, because a small mutation typically means that where something mutates, that means that it's probably close in space, right? So if you see like one of these letters keeps changing, or there's two letters that keep changing together, they're probably close in space. And that is a hint that, again, a machine learning model then can hopefully exploit through correlations and just gradient descent, which is exactly what AlphaFold does. And then the other one is proteins. They're not new, they again evolve. So one thing you also do is find through the database of crystallized proteins, which proteins look similar enough that maybe if we just get the structure of the protein that someone did in a lab, could be a useful input for the model to know, right? Like say, hey, I mean, if you literally get the protein you already know, you just copy paste what you already know, right? So that is what's called templates. That is an extra input to AlphaFold. Now, the database, this database of sequences, because they are cheap to maintain, it's a massive database, whereas the database of sequence or like folded proteins, that is rather small. It's like maybe 10 to 20K proteins that have been crystallized during the last many years of crystallization of these proteins, which is, again, very expensive to do. So one thing that kind of links nicely to the components, and I'll just give you a glimpse of the paper. The paper actually has, Nature papers usually are rather short, but then there's extra material, in this case in AlphaFold, I believe 64 pages. So it's actually, read the supplementary material because it has a lot of gems and ideas, maybe if you're doing machine learning and sequence modeling. And there's a lot of ablations on how each of these toolbox components affected the performance of AlphaFold. And here I'll walk you through a few basic ones that actually come from other fields. As I said, the impact of your research might have consequences that you wouldn't expect, as it was the case in AlphaFold. The first one is obviously transformers. In fact, these atoms or amino acids are in 3D space, and you can think of them as a graph, and that was actually quite useful. So graph neural networks is kind of a generalization of what transformers are. Transformers is a kind of graph neural network. And then if you actually look at the actual architecture, right, like I told you, there's these inputs that go into AlphaFold. So if you zoom in, you will see that there is a lot of graph neural networks, transformers, self-attention, cross-attention, and so on blocks through the different representations, now vectorized, that you map these inputs to eventually create the 3D coordinates of each of these amino acids in space, right? So again, not going to dive too much into the architectures, only to say that a lot of ideas, especially from language model, right? So in here, there's Gopher, which is a massive language model we trained and we released recently. And then also from AlphaStar, because we did work a lot on transformers in that project, sort of fed into this kind of architecture finesse, right, that was required to create AlphaFold. And this probably is the main contribution, is the actual architecture, although there are some other tricks that were quite impactful. So here, there's just a few ablations on ideas on attention and all sorts of details. Again, you can go to the paper. The point is that these were always ablated against, obviously, the CASP competition test set that we had, or the validation set. So we were always iterating against a known metric that we believed to be useful for us to try ideas and do trial and error. And that's kind of the first row there. The next idea, which is actually very cool, you might have heard of this, maybe not, but it's a simple, actually a different loss. So in language, instead of predicting from all the words up to time t, what's the next word, you could also kind of fill in the blanks. And there was this paper in 2018 called BERT that proposed, hey, you can mask a few words at the input and then try to predict them at the output instead of predicting always what word comes next. And that idea is very powerful because you don't need a lot of, you actually don't need training data, right? It's a language modeling loss, but it's a bit special and quite a nice one. So the simple idea was applied to this once you retrieve this sequence of evolutionary related sequences, because we have only 10 to 20,000 or so examples, right, in the PDB database. There's not a lot of labeled data, and machine learning, we know that data is key. So we added this auxiliary loss, which essentially made a secondary objective function to not only predict the 3D positions, but also, hey, can you predict what are each of these like little amino acids that I'm going to cover as the input, right? This auxiliary loss basically creates pressure for the model to try to internalize some other things, not only the 3D form, but other things that might be useful. And this comes for free. You don't need labels. All you need to do is mask randomly the inputs and predict the masked inputs at the output. So this idea was literally borrowed from the NLP community. And here, it has a dramatic effect, especially here on the left. The left-hand side are proteins that are a bit dissimilar to all the proteins you've seen before, right? So where not a lot of training data is. So it's, imagine you're classifying, and there may be certain classes that you've seen a lot, so you're pretty good at classifying those, but the ones that are rare, these would be the left-hand side here. Those ones you would overfit very quickly, and BERT is allowing you to overfit a bit less to those particular classes of proteins. Another very cool example, and in this case it's reverse, because even though we knew from the language friends at DeepMind that BERT was very useful, and that's how we got to apply it, there is also this retrieval of neighbors from this massive data set, which is actually created sort of an idea to maybe we could use this idea also for our language models by retrieving sentences that are similar when we're trying to predict what words comes next. This is not something that is new. Many people are trying sort of nearest neighbor and semi-parametric models in machine learning, but at least retro model, which was kind of together with Gopher, one of these big large language models, borrowed this idea actually from AlphaFold to retrieve from trillions of tokens and then use it to enhance its predictions. And these actually, the lookup tables or kind of using this extra information for AlphaFold itself is also quite critical. And this is this row of ablations that shows, again, that if you didn't include these MSAs, then you would lose performance, especially on the right-hand side, where you would have a lot of proteins that you've evolved from, but you're ignoring that data. So that's kind of what this ablation is showing. And then last but not least, there is a beautiful trick, which is, again, it's very cheap to get these sequences of letters. It's very expensive to get the 3D coordinates. So one thing that was done is iterate a process in which you take a lot of unlabeled examples, meaning sequences or proteins that we don't know how they look in 3D. We fold them with our system, and then we treat the fold we create with some tricks about rebalancing and so on. We treat those as training data. We add them to the training set, and then we go around and around. This is basically an idea that is about distillation that it has been used in a few projects as well as DeepMind, and it leverages millions of unlabeled sequences versus tens of thousands of labeled sequences that we have. And this was actually, again, critical. In this case, the plot is reversed, don't mind that, but especially here, where we basically all across the board, from the rare proteins that we don't have so much data for, the ones that we have, the delta between 0 and this is kind of clear that it was an improvement, and using this idea of distillation is key. So hopefully I gave you a bit of a glimpse of, okay, like how do you pick these pieces of the toolbox? Again, the paper is quite more detailed, so please take a look. But as you can see, these kind of systems are not like, they're a bit complex in this sense, but also it's cool to think, oh, someone had an idea in machine translation, and a few years later, it turns out that it now can fold proteins, right? That's really what amazes me about the field these days. Last but not least, I was saying that, of course, this method now enables you to very quickly fold proteins from all sorts of organisms, and we released a database that is massive. Of course, these are model predictions, so some of them will be better than others, but in general, you can expect this performance of 90 or so, but of course, people are now trying it out and they're finding some interesting results, which of course, we're taking into account for further research. And then last but not least, there's a nice kind of database that people, again, as I said, are interacting with lots of cool visualizations, which actually goes beyond just, oh, there's a breakthrough, there's a number that is bigger than it was before. I think this is the real impact of this sort of project, is when you can actually go out in the real world and have an impact. So you want to read more about AlphaFold or chat about more, happy to discuss this later. Cool. So for the last part, I'll discuss kind of a very different topic, not so much about science, but maybe more about reasoning and language, which is obviously how the transformer model was devised to do translation. Again, this is presenting on behalf of a large team of people that brought a lot of ideas and interesting insights and worked together. This is a bit more recent, so this project mostly happened in, I would say, 2022 second half or so. And you might have seen, as usual, these things usually come with some sort of press around the papers. So there's all sorts of chatter about, well, you know, computers can write their own code, so are programmers obsolete and so on. So I'll try to explain what it is that happened or what AlphaCode can do. And there's definitely many things it cannot do, but it's still nonetheless, to me, that I've seen a lot of like applications of sequence to sequence, encoder decoder, and sequence modeling in general. I really was quite skeptical, I must say, in early 2021 that we could achieve a level of performance that we achieved, which is not perfect, but it starts to be at human level and so on. So let's take a second here. I don't know how many of you here know about this competitive programming, but there's websites that people go and have some fun in competitions where basically you're given a problem, usually the textual description about an algorithmic task, and then you're, as a team, perhaps you get together, you have a few hours, and you're starting basically to try to code a solution. And these come with a nice backstory and so on, right? So this is an example. It's fairly representative, and it kind of describes, as I said in words, like you're given two strings, S and T, both consisting of lowercase English letters. You're going to type the string, like the string character by character from the first character to the last one. And there's here in this case, I think it explains a bit that you could type the letter off or click backspace, in which case, you know, you would not type the letter and remove the previous letter. And then you are about to write a program that would detect whether two given strings could be that you wrote the second string from this first string by either writing backspaces or writing it. And it kind of explains it in words, right? So this is the exact format. This is a model, actually a problem from the competitions. And then there's a bit more specification in terms of software specification type, right? So it tells you like what's the format of the input, what's expected for you to do in the output, print yes if you can obtain the string, T by typing the string S and replacing some characters with presses of backspace, or no if you cannot. And then after this sort of textual description, it also defines the bounds of the inputs you will receive, what's the length of each string, and so on. It actually shows you so that you kind of, as a human, understand a bit, okay, here is an example, right? There's 4, and then there's these letters, right? And then the output in this case is yes, no, no, yes, right? So, okay, like if I write a program, it better be the case that at least for this toy example that is given to you, your program satisfies this, right? So that, you know, it's always been a kind of a very interesting and intriguing setting because it mixes, of course, natural language, right? These usually sometimes come with a backstory about like, that might be relevant to solving the problem, to be honest, but just take a look if you want other examples. But it's cool because here the goal is to algorithmically, can you map this sequence of words to a program, right? A program that you can basically compile and run and see if the program is correct. And that setting to us was quite interesting. AlphaCode, what it did from this, and this is again a real example, reads all these letters, all these characters, right? And then basically prints this program that then we just kind of upload to the website to see whether, oh, this program is correct or not, right? And again, I'm not an excellent programmer, so there is a limit for which, oh, I don't quite understand it, but there's a few people in the team that are quite good. So I will say sometimes AlphaCode has impressed, but sometimes it also does things that are not that impressive. But here is kind of to visualize, right? That's exactly what you would see in this case. It writes a Python program, and then once it writes it, you have to test it, whether it passes the test or not. And in this case, this program is correct, and we can kind of try to reason, oh, what does this program do? Which is also something cool beyond what you typically see in machine learning, where explainability is a bit tricky. Here, we can actually use a neural network, which we don't maybe understand how it's working, why is it outputting this sequence of characters, but at least the program that it generates, we can actually dissect a bit more, which is also a very cool side effect. So one of the motivations of working on code generation, there's a few, but one of them is novelty. So in standard natural language processing, typically there is a test set of sentences you have not seen during training, but the distributions tend to overlap quite a lot, right? They're from the same domain, right? So you would get English sentences that people typically write in a web browser and that's your test set would be another sample from this set. In Cogen, what we try to do, every time there's a new competition, like you don't want to repeat programs or problems, otherwise people would cheat and we just look for the solutions. So the setting is interesting because those who write these problems online do it trying to be innovative so that you challenge the humans that usually participate in these things, and the best ones, of course, participate in every competition, right? So for us, that was a nice property, that there's this novelty or unseen aspect of the data. The other one is metrics. It's hard to, I mean, it's an ongoing topic. I heard this in 2013, and we still use the same metric, blue score for translation. People don't like it, but it's very hard to know, oh, is this translation good or not? And we have an imperfect methodology to know that. Usually you ask a human to translate the sentence, and then there's some sort of overlap of n-grams to see whether your produced translation is the same or similar to the one that a human produced, a professional translator. But there's a lot of it's a bit subjective, it's not great. Whereas for code, you run the code and that's it, right? If it's correct, it's correct, and if it's not, well, it's not. So it's nice that you have this way to automatically know if your model is better or not, because you can evaluate it without any subjectiveness, basically. And similarly, like there's reward computation that you can basically automate all this system, as I said, by you have a few test examples, input, output examples, your program must be correct on. And then you can run this, and if it passes all the tests, you hope that your code is correct, which I'll get to because that's not always true, of course. So zooming a bit, and again, maybe taking not the toolbox approach exactly, but more the project-to-project approach. A lot that we've learned in language modeling, in this massive language model, Gopher, that we released, went into, including, of course, the software and so on, into AlphaCode. But AlphaCode is essentially a translation system, much like AlphaFold, which translates from the letters through the 3D position. In here, we translate from letters, words, these problem descriptions that people come up with, to literally the program in, we use Python or C++. We have the same, basically you can choose, you can ask the model to produce either or, but it's a very simple setting of translating the description in natural language to the program that you can run on a machine, hopefully, right? You don't know if the program will run. That's one of the challenges and not the hardest. So the approach we took, there's a lot of red arrows that exemplify like lots of ideas coming from actually AlphaStar, AlphaFold, and AlphaGo actually, because there's a lot of search that goes into this. Search is a very powerful tool that, of course, AlphaGo system used through MCTS. So the approach is not that complicated. We start first with GitHub. GitHub has a lot of code. It's not code competition. Maybe there's some, but a lot of it is not about competitions. Then you pre-train a language model that will be a good prior over these programs that exist on GitHub. Then we have a small set, again, for some reason is actually similar to AlphaFold, maybe 10 to 15,000 or so input-output examples of actual problem descriptions that humans come up with. So that's why there are not so many. You need to do this very carefully to then its solutions, right? So this is, you have the input, the description in natural language, and then you have solutions. There's actually more than one solution that we have, but descriptions or problem settings, we have, again, 14,000 or so, I think. And then what we do is take this pre-trained language model that knows a lot about the GitHub, and we fine-tune it to this small data set with some tricks. Again, details will be in the paper, but it is important, right? This is a two-step process. It's very common. You pre-train a model and then you fine-tune it. We've seen these nowadays, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, in a lot of places, and this is one of the ones in which it worked. And then the AlphaGo connection comes in, because we're not doing MCTS search. We tried, so far we couldn't make it work. But what we're doing is then, hey, I have a new problem, right? So this problem here is from the test set. What you're gonna do is generate a lot of programs for a given problem. And a lot means like a million, okay? So there's a lot of programs you generate. You could think of this as trial and error you could do as a human, but of course, you can sample quite a bit more than maybe you and I can write programs. And then critically, you have now this massive amount of programs, many of which do not compile or are not good. And you have to do some sort of smart filtering and clustering to commit to only a very small portion of them. Otherwise, it would be quite unfair for, I mean, the machine, sure, we can write many programs. It doesn't cost us much other than time and waiting for like the GPUs or the TPUs to produce more samples. But ultimately, we want to only select a subset that a human participant to these competitions would feel, okay, you haven't tried basically every single program that exists, you tried a reasonable amount. And in this case, we actually select only 10, which feels reasonable given the statistics we see from the human competitors that participate online. There's another cool idea that's, well, we sample a lot, but these samples might look very similar to one another. So we took an idea from AlphaStar, which was to sort of at the beginning of the program, you're inputting sort of few characteristics of the solution, right? So people that write solutions, that you can characterize them. Characterizations are simple, actually. There's like, what's the rating? So what's the difficulty of the problem? Then people can tag their solution, oh, it uses dynamic programming and so on. So you just have a few tags that exist in the database. What language did you write your solution in? And then whether the solution is correct or incorrect. I mean, incorrect solutions, they're not great, but they're useful actually for us to learn a model of how the mapping between natural language and plausible programs that might solve these look like. So what we do is we condition on this during training. We know the correct rating, the tags, the language, and so on. But then when we sample a million times, we randomize this a lot. And it's quite interesting to see that. Imagine if you believe your solution is correct, well, actually the language model is more likely to produce correct solutions. Or if you think maybe the problem is harder than it actually is, then that might also help. So there's a few things surprising that happened. Again, more details about this in the paper. And then one technique that actually has no arrows, because this is something we did that is fairly new, is, well, okay, now we sample from a diverse set of programs, as diverse as we can. We need to pick a few of them. I mean, you can pick 10 randomly, you can do many techniques. But one thing we did was we tried to pick from a diversity standpoint, and diversity in the functional sense, right? So a program is a function that maps inputs to outputs. So simply put, what we do is, okay, how do we given a program description, we can generate inputs, right? We actually can generate inputs. We have inputs also given by the test that are publicly available, but it's better to generate more inputs. So we train a neural network to generate inputs, right? So imagine if there's an integer, okay, generate random integer from 1 to 100, and if it's a string, you generate a random string. And then you can pass these inputs to every program you generate and see what the outputs look like. These inputs might be nonsensical, but it still is a function, so you can ask it to produce f of x. And then we cluster the programs, the 1 million programs we sample, based on how the outputs look like, right? So in this case, there's 2 programs that produce the same outputs for the same inputs. So these probably are similar enough. So we're gonna sample maybe from this cluster only once. And then there's another cluster that it looks different, like it's maybe the program is trying to do something else. So to enhance the 10 choices or the 10 attempts we have to, let's actually pick only 10 programs. We try to maximize coverage and diversity. This is a technique that is fairly general. Again, would be happy to see this in another project somewhere else. But this came actually from nowhere. This was something we kind of envisioned to be useful for this particular application. So as I was saying, it all relies on data. So we have actually a very large amount of GitHub data. We took the reasonably licensed code in GitHub, which happens to be 700 gigabytes. So this is a lot of data to train on. And then we actually curated, there is a few data sets, but there's some problems with them. So actually we open source the code contest data set, which we use to train our models, that contains 13,000 or so unique problems. And each problem comes with a few solutions, because of course it's easy to come up with solutions. You put these competitions online and then many enthusiasts try to write solutions. So there's about 900 solutions per problem or so. And then, as I was saying, we had validation and test data that is split temporally to ensure we're not just kind of copy pasting some solutions from problems that are in the future, which would not be great. And a caveat about data sets and about this problem is that we create, I mean, you have code, it runs, and there are these very small tests that show in the description itself, right? Like very short kind of illustrative examples. It better be that your program passes those small input-output tests. Now, some data sets have a few more tests that are private. You're not allowed to see them in the description. You're not seeing, but at least at the test, on the test side, you can say, hey, the program is correct. There's secret tests, and then you run them. And if all of the secret tests pass, that's how you declare success that you've achieved or you solved this problem. But the data sets out there happen to have a high false positive rate. Even our own, if we just have the generated tests, a few tests that exist, we find that code that looks correct and passes all the tests is actually, in fact, 60% or 30% of the time, depends on the data set, not correct at all, which is not a great setting because we can claim, oh, we solved all the problems in this data set, where in fact, you only solved maybe 30 or 40%. So we put more tests by doing some heuristics that happen to reduce this false positive rate to about 4%. So hopefully this is a useful data set for those who work in program synthesis or code generation, with the caveat that this code can actually still be slow. You might be implementing a naive quadratic algorithm where an n log n solution exists. We so far ignored slowness. So some of our correct solutions sadly were marked as incorrect because they were slow, but that's obviously how the server evaluates you when you go and compete online. So I describe a little bit of this, but essentially we need to submit at most 10 times 10 different programs that our algorithm comes with, and there is a web server that decides whether the solutions are correct or slow, and if they're slow, they're marked incorrect, which again, we didn't do anything about. I'll go slightly fast through the results, just to say that having these, we have an internal metric that we were able to track over time, and that was quite important. Initially, we were at almost 0% solve rate over this test set that we had developed for rapid evaluation, that we didn't need to go to a website and introduce, copy paste the text into AlphaCode and then copy paste the answer. I mean, that's what literally we did for the real evaluation, but that was not very convenient. So in our internal metric, you can see a lot of these things like MLM loss, which is BERT, actually, again, here strikes back, and many other things like clustering that I mentioned, and sampling, tempering, value condition, scaling up is also important, brought us to a level which we thought maybe now we're at about human level. Human level here means people participate in these competitions, a self-selected set of programmers go online and pit themselves against the people that write these programs. And then once we evaluated in that setting, literally going to the website, we find that AlphaCode was in the top 54% of, there were like 10 competitions that happened. I think every 1 week or two, there's new competition. So we took a few of them, and then we sort of participated by running the system in basically blind to those competitions, because obviously they happen after the model was trained. And then we ranked about average, which is obviously not the best human, but it's quite impressive given the level of problems that we were able to solve. And then if you compute an ELO rating, you rank about top 30% of so, as you can see, AlphaCode here, compared to other competitors. There's actually quite a few active users that like this sort of thing. I was one of them back in the day, although I wasn't nearly as good as AlphaCode. So it seems like I keep training models to beat me first at StarCraft, which I also liked a lot, and then at this. So it's a kind of sad reality. I'll skip a bit of these. There's some scaling analysis that is very nice. But I'll just sort of conclude by maybe showing a couple of cool things that we found. So this felt kind of too magical. So we tried a few things. For instance, it turns out that if we simplify the problem description, solve rate goes up. If we change the description, in ways that it changes the task, the solve rate goes down. And if we introduce typos and so on in the natural language section, then the solve rate sort of seems to be the same. And then we also analyze, hey, what if we remove the IO specification, the textual thing that says, hey, there's a string of, at most 10 to the 5 or whatever. That was the most important thing, that if we removed, performance dropped more. Then problem description was the next most important thing. And actually the example IO examples, this was the least important. And so there is a table of all these cool ablations you can do by basically tampering with the descriptions. And to show you a clear example, the solve rate for this particular ablation was 17% on the original, and opposite dropped to 0%. And opposite is sort of playing with the problem in a way that you say, hey, find the maximum value. Well, we change it to find the minimum value. And then it generates code, but it's incorrect, which shows that, of course, the AlphaCode is not just kind of writing programs that might happen to work. It really is reading the description. So we have lots of ablations about those kind of things to make sure that it works. So to conclude, and then maybe to open it up for questions, I think we have the room for another hour, but of course, happy to shorten it a bit. But I think to me, the cool thing is this laser focus on applications deeply as like maybe generating code or NLP or vision can and usually has wide impact, especially if you do this in a way that they will be general, that they cannot be added to the deep learning toolbox. There's a bit of domain specificity sometimes, but if you can make it elegant enough, maybe it applies to actually quite a wider set of domains that you did not anticipate. And then another learning that is beyond the toolbox is that, well, there are humans behind these projects and teams. And it's quite interesting to see the influence. That's what I showed this other view of this tree of like projects that happen at DeepMind, on how teams and people in these teams sort of mix and transfer knowledge and maybe biases in their own research to the projects in a way that usually creates quite innovative research and outcome. Now, zooming out back to the projects that usually tend to be larger in time and the teams that we have a few at DeepMind, both AlphaFold and AlphaCode, there was a lot of thought put into the metric, because we always iterate, or like, is the learning rate too high, or is this trick gonna work or not? It's very important we have a good metric that is stable over time, so then we can assess whether an idea is working or not, right? So that is quite an important element for these projects that span months or years. And then maybe quite a trend that I'm seeing in machine learning, which I was maybe more skeptical about, is that we need lots of data. AlphaFold distilled from these millions and millions of sequences itself, and AlphaCode used GitHub as kind of a, oh, this is awesome, I kind of know how to code anything. And then, but then after that, with this very small amount of data, tens of thousands of examples, you were able to sharpen these amounts of knowledge that you got into doing something very specific, from GitHub to, for instance, code competitions. And I think this is kind of an interesting trend that I'm expecting seeing more results, and also I hope to see more research to improve that. So with that, we can see what's happening online. I have no idea if Zoom still works on my computer, hopefully. But yeah, thanks a lot for those who came here all the way as well. Thank you so much. You wanna? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Oriol, again for giving such a great talk. If there's anyone with questions here, yeah. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
So you said you know the time complexity during time.
Yeah.
Because animated, there's some time complexity. But I feel like focus usually have some law bound about the time, and also the solution. And sometimes it was more complexity about that. And tell me what to get what would happen if we had some criteria about maybe some time complexity or some.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. I mean, the question is about AlphaCode and what happens with the. I mean, you could add time complexity basically in your loss, or you could try to when you search, you could filter solutions that look fast. We didn't do any of that. Obviously, that might be in the future. But what happens though is that even though, I mean, it's still accurate that we did not regard the runtime at all. But of course, when a solution is marked correct, that means the solution was correct and fast, right? So at least the model, when it's asking for a correct solution, hopefully understands not only that, oh, there's a specification that I must obey, but also there is a bias on the data set that those correct solutions happen to also be fast. Otherwise, they would not be marked correct. But it's so subtle, and we have only a few thousand examples that I think more can be done. And in fact, adding, I mean, something that, for instance, Yuja and myself worked before starting this project was actually neural programming interpreters, where actually the goal is create a sorting algorithm that is fast, and then you can define a reward. And I think those lines of work to code optimization are also quite valid. And we decided to simplify that out in this project. But I agree, we could add this, and probably it would be better in terms of how we would rank, because I'm sure we know, I mean, we submitted many solutions that probably were correct, but they timed out. It's very sad when you see in the website timeout instead of incorrect, but it did happen quite a few times. So I am quite hopeful that this ELO rating we achieved, which is 1300, could be quite much higher if we regarded the speed of the algorithm you generated a bit more, which we didn't. Let's do someone else though. Sorry, like just for like, I'll repeat the question. Yeah, here.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. How sensitive is AlphaCode to the programming language? So for example, if you pre-trained it like all on Python, and then how much fine-tuning would you have to do on a different language for it to generalize?
Yeah, there's a question about language, programming language. So the GitHub stage, we train actually on all languages, including like C#, Java, etc. And then because the data sets, the most popular programming languages that people that participate in this competition is Python and C++, because C++ happens to be faster and so on. Those are the two ones that we focused on. And I forgot exactly what the results were. It's possible, and it kind of, you could think it makes sense that for the higher programs that problems that we solve, those of higher difficulty, I believe if we then ask, basically to generate a solution in either Python or C++, you literally write it in C++, and then AlphaCode would write it, or you write it in Python and you would write it in Python. And I believe C++ for the higher difficulty ones had a slightly larger solve rate. So this is also something that we randomize it. We kind of ask basically half and half. When we generate 10, is half in Python, half in C++. But it would be interesting to dive a bit deeper into what kind of problems it solved. I think you could imagine, oh, well, C++ is because the programmers are better in C++. I mean, sorry if you're offended by that. But yeah, we observe a little bit of this, but there's lots of cool analysis as well in the paper. I forgot exactly because this is by memory, the C++ versus Python issue, but yeah. But the cool thing is it's the same neural network. I mean, you don't change anything. It doesn't specialize. It just kind of can do both. Because ultimately it writes kind of the program basically token by token, character by character. So that does not, you could do other languages, and it's the convenient ones given the amount of data. Cool, let's see. Yeah, on the right, yeah. Yeah, an idea on how large the models are. So the AlphaFold model, I forgot, it's not very large because there's not that much data. The AlphaCode, I know, because you train on so much, pre-train on so much data, I think we haven't hit the limit of large. It's just like at some point you have to decide, well, I'm going to be training this model for 3 weeks, and then it shouldn't be that large. So you choose the size a bit more in practice. The model that we submitted and we report in the paper is 41 billion parameters, which is reasonably large in the language modeling space. I think the largest language models maybe are pushing now 500 billion parameters or so. But if you go to 7 billion, we have a few ablations in the paper. 7 billion is doing nearly as well. And then 300 million, these are not working very well, right? So these are kind of, in terms of parameters, there's kind of a point where it dramatically improves, and that might be around a billion parameters, so 10 to the 9 weights that you have to store and train, which is, yeah, part of the large language models. Cool, let's see. Go to the left there, maybe. Yeah, you. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you see AlphaCode comparing to other sorts of large code generations, like GitHub Copilot?
Yeah.
Is there some nuance to the task setting?
Yeah, the question is about, there's some people probing large language models about coding. Codex is a good example. I think the comparison, so I like, it's kind of different domains. I think if you look, Codex is maybe more like helping the user, and there's more about like API calls and so on, right? So it's a way to accelerate production of code, and I think that's how they're testing it, and I think it's quite an awesome application. And then for us, it was more about the algorithmic rather than or how do you call like this API of Java or something like that. Obviously, there's the starting point is basically the same, because the GitHub pre-training, that's common in both. But then there is some uniqueness to both the settings. I think sampling many times, we push that compared to the kinds of things you saw, for instance, in Codex. I think they sampled 100 times, and we literally, at the edge, we sample 1,000,000 times to solve a single problem, which that shows you there's some future work. I mean, that's even us, even if we trial and error, or it doesn't compile. I mean, I don't think anyone here like tries 1,000,000 times literally, but we try quite a few times, right? So that's kind of mimicking a bit also how humans develop algorithms iteratively, right? But yeah, it's the application domain is very different, and there's one that's a bit more interactive, but I would say less deep algorithmically. But it would be cool to test both systems. That's why you put also data set out there, right? So, but yeah, these. I think the cool thing now is we got to like 50 percentile, which is like, okay, median participant. But to unlock maybe really the top end, maybe we'll need other advancements beyond even deep learning, which is kind of quite exciting, to be honest. Yep. Okay, let's do, yeah, you up there. Yeah, so I think the question is about interpretability. And I think this is where it gets interesting to me, because there is a pure neural network that generates a symbolic, program. But you could start imagining different projects where maybe you have the neural network that generates the program might actually start to be hybrid itself, right? I mean, there might, like, in fact, I always see AlphaGo as a hybrid neural network and a program that is doing a tree search, right? So for me, that seems like a powerful future direction of research, and maybe it can be applied here for its own generating the pure symbolic system. But I think what people find it, I mean, if I think of, okay, I will generate either, let's say I have an algorithmic task like sorting, and I want to put it in production, let's say in a Google index server, which probably sorts quite a few things. I have a neural network that does this kind of, you input maybe the indices, and then it outputs the sorted indices. Or I generate a program with a neural net, and I can read the program and understand it. I mean, I definitely choose the second for some time, although maybe the first one is faster and it's also correct, but it will be so hard to prove that this nonlinear function is gonna not fail in some corner case. Whereas the program, we have tools, we can prove. I mean, there's actually verification tools. We haven't tried here. That's not how they run these competitions. But I think to me that bit of quote unquote interpretability is quite powerful. So, but I also believe programs themselves will hit a limit. So maybe you have to, at some point, have a hybrid model like AlphaGo, where you cannot just code the whole thinking of where to play. There was at some point a neural net that took over and said, look, this move looks bad, but just don't try it, right? And it obviously produced the results that were amazing. So, but yeah, I really like the interpretability aspect of this. And it's one that I think probably, yeah, for some applications, I think it will come quite handy. Cool. Yeah, let's do some online. I don't know. Do I moderate this or there's?
So there's a chat here. That's most of the questions.
Okay, I'll try to read a bit online what I see super quickly. I'll pick my favorite question. Okay, I like this one. There's a question which I'll answer with a tweet. How do you decide whether to name a model alpha something? And so there was, I think it was Demis that tweeted the AlphaCode, and then someone said, of course this is a cool result because you name it alpha something. So it's somehow, we only realize it then, like we name alpha something when it's like a large project. But I think in general, if it's a new capability that we were surprised by, maybe that's the real answer. We could name something alpha something, although usually that doesn't mean solving. For instance, AlphaFold technically is AlphaFold 2 because there was AlphaFold in 2018, and it didn't solve it the same way that it's AlphaFold 2 solved the problem. So, but I think it's leap forward, kind of large, is usually a large project as well. But yeah, I like this question. Okay. Oh, I have to read so many things. Maybe you choose your favorite if there's any. But let me see if there's. Yeah, there's an interesting question about a detail about AlphaCode, which asks, do you use one or multiple solutions per coding problem in the training set, right? So as I said, there's about 900 or so solutions per given problem. And even the incorrect ones might be useful because, as I said, even if someone was incorrect, they probably were on the right track by some definition, since they had decided to submit that solution to the web server. So what we do in training is you sample a problem and then you sample any solution, right, uniformly. So you see all the solutions eventually, but what's the problem is that there's not so many problem descriptions, but we have quite a few more solutions. But we don't discard any solution. In fact, not even the incorrect, which we shouldn't call solutions. And so during training, you pick a pair of problem and then any solution, and then you train with that sample, and then you keep training. There's not a lot of data, actually, so the fine-tuning stage is actually fairly short compared to pre-training on GitHub. But this is a good question, so thanks for asking. Yeah, you have one, okay.
Yeah, so one question from YouTube. So when managing these really large team projects, how do you like allocate resources? Do you like explore multiple solutions at once? So like besides having clear metric, are there other things you do to manage it effectively?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I love these meta research questions, right? Because I mean, you experience, like as a researcher, of course, like, you know, you go from grad student to joining a company and individual contributor. Now, like you start somehow maybe mentoring some interns and then managing and so on. And same happens with projects, right? You might think of an idea and you write a very influential, possibly, ideally, paper to a conference, but then these projects, maybe the alpha style projects, they're a bit larger. So it's, I mean, there's a lot of learnings. Maybe let me share. So an important learning has been that whoever is leading the project should communicate to the whole team. So it's very important to have group meetings, right, about progress, but then it's also important to kind of pick up with individuals, because everyone will have, you know, the projects are hard, not the progress you can see here, the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there are times where things are that we don't improve the metric and nothing works. So it's quite important to, as a lead at least, to communicate quite a lot with everyone in the team. And then in terms of the metric, like if you have a clear metric, then a good trick that you use is you start the meetings, the group meetings, by showing the metric and just basically saying, okay, like in the last, maybe you meet every week or every 2 weeks, you can just say, okay, this is the metric, just kind of as a reminder, because as a researcher, there is a tendency to sometimes you're in love with an idea, and then you really try to make certain, I don't know, like I'll use an AlphaStar example. We thought hierarchical reinforcement learning had to be the answer. So we were trying quite a long time with that, but all the results were coming from other ideas, from multi-agent, from deep learning, from imitation learning. So at some point, we had to abandon that idea, even though hierarchical reinforcement learning sounds an amazing research direction, because, well, it wasn't advancing, the main goal we had at the time. So I think realizing what's the metric, if there is a metric, sometimes you're not so lucky, is another maybe learning from running these projects. There's so many of them, but yeah, join one of these projects if you want to come to DeepMind, and you will experience it first person. We have quite a few of these. It's very fun though.
Okay, yeah, thank you everyone for coming. We now have an EI social on the second floor of Stata. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, please come with us.
Awesome. See you everyone. Thank you.